While DreamWorks' rival Disney is known for killing off their villains in some pretty gruesome ways, DreamWorks Animation is full of great bad guys. We've already done a video on how evil these guys can be, and although it can be fun to watch a villain do their thing, sometimes it's more fun to watch their endings. Most of their villains are either reformed, get their comeuppance, are arrested, or just have ambiguous endings. Still, for those rare times where a DreamWorks villain is given their ultimate end, we're here to rank them from quick and relatively painless to harsh and brutal even for a bad guy. I'm Kyle with Wicked Binge, and this is DreamWorks Villain Deaths, Gruesome to Most Gruesome. First off, we'll be starting with the more ambiguous deaths, where we don't see their death on screen, but it's heavily implied enough that we feel we can make a decent argument for it. Starting off, we have Zekel Khan from The Road to El Dorado. He was an ambitious villain, always scheming and very much bloodthirsty, literally, considering how much he focused on sacrifices. When Zekel was tricked into falling into a whirlpool which sent him into the jungle outside of El Dorado, he was willing to lead General Cortez to the City of Gold as a means of revenge. However, when they find the entrance to El Dorado blocked, Cortez assumes that Zekel was lying to him and takes him away.
There is no El Dorado here.
We never see what happens to him, but given the time period and the circumstances he was pushed into, due to the quick save, we can assume that he either lived out the rest of his days as a slave or in prison. Given how cruel Cortez seemed and how people like him often saw people like Zekel as savages, it's also possible that he could have just executed Zekel as soon as they arrived back in Spain, not seeing a use for him. While all of these possible ends are pretty harsh, we have to put Zekel at the bottom of our list simply due to the ambiguity to his end, and the possibility of him still having a fairly long, albeit painful and harsh, life. Next up is the How to Train Your Dragon villain, Drago. Having control of the Bewilderbeast, also known as the Alpha Dragon, Drago nearly gains control of all dragons. But after Toothless defeated the Bewilderbeast and became the new Alpha, the Bewilderbeast had no choice but to dive back into the ocean and swim away, with Drago still on it. Hiccup had offered him one last chance to leave peacefully, but Drago had stubbornly refused help and remained on his Bewilderbeast until the very end.
Let this end now!
Never!
Although his Bewilderbeast successfully made it to the hidden world, Drago's ultimate fate remains unknown outside of Grimmel mentioning his defeat. But given that the Bewilderbeast swam away, we can only assume that Drago eventually drowned, which can be either a peaceful way to go or a brutal way to go, depending on who you ask. And even if he had been able to hang on to the Bewilderbeast, who's to say that he didn't end up getting eaten by a water creature or another dragon, or even succumbing to hypothermia because of the water. Either way, even if we don't see his ultimate fate, this guy probably isn't coming back anytime soon. Next up is Mrs. Tweety from Chicken Run. For being an old chicken farmer, Mrs. Tweety is pretty durable. We see her get briefly knocked out by Rocky, climb a string of Christmas lights with an axe in her teeth, get smacked into a billboard, fall from the chicken's homemade airplane, and land in a vat of boiling gravy. And after all that, she's somehow still alive. Or is she?
I told you they was organized.
In her last scene, we see a door fall on her, and we don't really see the aftermath. On the one hand, having a heavy wooden door fall on you seems like the last nail in the coffin that you'd need to kill off a character. But on the other hand, after everything she had already survived, seeing Mrs. Tweety actually survive this injury maybe wouldn't be all that surprising. After all, the door would be heavy, but not that heavy. Not as heavy as something like rock or metal, as we'll see later on this list. Still, if this was indeed the finishing blow, it was a pretty painful way to go. So while we have to keep it on the lower end of the list due to its ambiguity, it does get a couple bonus gruesome points. Finishing up the ambiguous section is Dr. Zara from Abominable. Zara's death comes after she triggers an avalanche by accidentally hitting the mountain with her snowmobile in her attempts to kill Everest. As such, this could be seen as both a fall death since the avalanche pushes her snowmobile off the mountain, and a crush death given the hundreds of pounds of snow that falls on her. While you'd naturally assume that no human would survive a situation like this, you have to remember that Zara's snowmobile was pretty strong. With it being so fortified, you have to wonder if maybe she could survive both the fall and the snow's impact since she was still strapped inside the snowmobile. However, given the dangerous and harsh environment she was still in, it's unlikely that Zara would have made it out of the mountains alive even if she had survived the fall. We feel that added ambiguity actually adds to the gruesomeness of this potential death. Think about it. When your choices are either a hard fall, getting crushed by falling snow that came after a huge fall, or freezing to death in the mountains, it's hard to decide which of these awful fates would be the worst. With those out of the way, let's move on to the more unique and seemingly painless deaths. Unfortunately for the rest of the villains on this list, we only have 2 baddies that fall into this category. Topping this section is the fairy godmother from Shrek 2. Being a magic wielder with many different spells in her arsenal, it could have gone much worse for the fairy godmother in terms of death, given that the spell that ultimately destroyed her was also one that she tried to use against Shrek and Fiona to get rid of them once and for all. You'd be forgiven for thinking that her end would have been a bit more, well, explosion-y. But instead, Fairy Godmother goes out not in a blaze of glory, but a blaze of bubbles. She turns into bubbles. With how quick it happens and how painless it seems, it's probably the happiest end that someone as evil as her could have hoped for. Moving on, next is Tai Lung from the Kung Fu Panda series. Like Fairy Godmother, his end probably could have been a lot more painful had he not been fighting someone as unconventional as Po. He does get plenty of bruises and injuries, but what does Tai Lung in is the extremely powerful Wuxi Finger hold move. We're putting this death above Fairy Godmother's not because it seems more painful, but because of the fear Tai Lung shows before it happens.
The whooshy finger hold? Oh, you know this hold.
Though seemingly quick and painless, it's still technically a means of death, even if he's essentially just sent to the spirit realm and unable to return. The only thing that could add to the gruesomeness of this was if someone like Kai did something to his spirit, perhaps even stealing his life force. But since we don't see this, we can only speculate. In any case, since the actual death didn't seem to be too painful or prolonged, we feel that we have to rank it low. Now, I hope you're not afraid of heights, because next are the deaths that were a result of falls from great heights. A classic when it comes to animated deaths. First up is Humpty Dumpty from Puss in Boots. Out of all the deaths on this list, Humpty Dumpty's is probably the most bittersweet, since his death also acts as a redemption as well as a heroic sacrifice.
You have to save the baby, or the mama will destroy San Ricardo.
He chose to die as a way to not only save his former best friend, as well as the town, but as a way to try and make up for everything he had done. Though he does have a great fall, just like the old rhyme said, seeing him leave behind a golden egg makes this death just a bit less sad. Even so, he was still cracked like, well, an egg, and broke on impact. Maybe just a little gruesome to think about, but we still feel this falls on the lower end of painful and gruesome villain deaths. Next is General Mandible from Ants. For a little ant, life is pretty tough. There are many things that can kill a bug, from being stepped on to drowning to even being attacked by bigger bugs. For General Mandible, his end was not only due to gravity, but his own anger and ego. If not for him attacking and trying to kill Cutter and Z, there's a good chance he would have lived. But while Z was lucky enough to survive a fall into water, Mandible instead ended up hitting a thick root. As if the fall wasn't bad enough, hitting something that hard and painful would surely make any viewer wince. And even knowing that it was most likely an instant death doesn't quite take away from the brutality factor. Finishing up our falling section is Grimmel the Grizzly, from the third Dragons movie. Being a dragon hunter and rider, it's almost poetic that Grimmel was killed by falling out of the sky. Like with Mandible, the experience must have been pretty terrifying for Grimmel, knowing that there was no way but down. Maybe that was why he was so desperate to take Hiccup with him, spending most of the fall focusing on ripping off Hiccup's armor and fighting with him. Unfortunately, when he tries to hold on to Hiccup in the hopes that the Light Fury will have to rescue him as well, he ends up grabbing onto Hiccup's prosthetic leg. leg. Once Hiccup removes his fake leg, it's pretty much game over for Grimmel. It should also be noted that although he falls into the ocean instead of Earth, at that height, it really doesn't matter either way. It would have still been deadly, and if by some miracle he did survive the fall, his body would still be too broken to attempt swimming, and he still would have died by a mix of intense pain and drowning. With all that in mind, Grimmel's death is definitely the most brutal falling death on our list. But with that wrapped up, this next short section is another animated death classic. These are the crush deaths. Getting a much more painful death than his mother is Prince Charming. In Shrek the Third, we see that it's not enough for Charming to kill Shrek and take over Far, Far Away, but he also has to do it in front of an audience as well. Honestly, we'd expect nothing less from an egomaniac like him.
Prepare, foul beast! Your time is done!
Since he had been planning on stabbing Shrek, you could say that it was karma that Charming got a death much worse than stabbing. As an extra bit of irony, the stone tower that he was eventually crushed by was part of the set that he had spent so long putting together. But on the bright side, at least his death was dramatic. Finishing up this section is another Kung Fu Panda villain, Shen. Like Charming, Shen's death falls under being both painful and ironic, given that he ends up being crushed by the exact same cannon that he used to try and hunt and kill Po and the other Furious Five.
I scarred you for life.
His death was also his own fault, since while fighting Po, he was the one who cut the ropes that were holding the wreckage of his destroyed cannon. Factor in the added explosion that came with the cannon falling, and you have a pretty painful death. What makes this death all the more tragic is that, by the expression Shen makes when the cannon falls on him, it's implied that he's not only accepted his death, but that maybe he had cut the ropes on purpose rather than on accident. Of course, he was still trying to kill Po too, but maybe the intent had been to try and take them both out since he knew that after everything he had done, there would be no other way to escape punishment. If Shen did indeed choose his death, that level of acceptance does push the cruelness of it a bit down, but it doesn't make death by heavy explosive cannon any less painful. Finally, we've come to the cruelest deaths. The most brutal, and without a doubt painful ends for any DreamWorks villain. These cruel deaths also happen to be our top 5. First up, we have Chef and Creek from Trolls. Now, you may not even remember this particular death. We only see Chef getting knocked into her serving card after she refuses to accept the peace between the trolls and the Burgeons, with Creek accidentally coming along as a stowaway. But then, in a mid-credits scene, we see them both get eaten by a hill monster. It's a fitting fate for a chef who tried to cook and eat creatures as innocent as the trolls.
Come on, eat!
Being eaten whole by a creature is pretty brutal, especially if Chef and Creek had to live through being digested. On that note, similarly, we have Lord Farquaad's death from Shrek. When it comes to painful and gruesome deaths, being eaten by a dragon is kind of in a league of its own. We've already established that getting eaten alive by any creature is bad, but getting eaten by something as scary as a dragon is all the more terrifying. Like Chef and Creek, Farquaad also likely had to live through the disgusting and painful process of being digested, and in a stomach that was likely much smaller than that of a hill monster's. But unlike Chef and Creek, whose death was more of a quick ending gag than anything else, Farquaad's death just had much more weight and impact to it, making it all the more memorable. So yeah, just because this particular instance of someone getting eaten isn't particularly gory, doesn't make it any less gruesome or terrifying. While very much a spectacle, Kai from the final Kung Fu Panda movie and his death isn't exactly your traditional explosion. Instead of having to deal with fire or dynamite taking him out, Kai is destroyed after getting exactly what he wanted: chi. Having the chi of the entire panda village at his disposal, Po was able to overwhelm Kai with it, and as such, the extreme power and pressure that Kai felt from the chi attack caused him to disintegrate from existence.
Too much! That's too much!
Not only was this painful, but the added pain of being unable to control or stop the flow of chi just adds to how terrifying this death must have been for Kai. It just goes to show that you don't always need a big fire to go out with a bang. Though, as seen with our last two entries, a bit of fire certainly doesn't hurt either. Galaxar from Monsters vs. Aliens gets our silver medal for most gruesome death. When we saw Galaxar set his ship to self-destruct, I think we all knew just how this guy was going to go out. Being at the core of his ship, he certainly felt that explosion too.
And we're all going and there's nothing you can do about it!
You also have to add in the anticipation of it, and how it must have felt for Galaxar being so close to escaping his fate, only to go down with his spaceship in the end. While we can definitely consider it fiery, painful, and gruesome, there is one thing keeping it from the top spot. Though we doubt that it did much considering that it was caught up in a literal explosion, Galaxar was in his escape pod when the self-destruct was activated. The pod may have just protected him from the worst of it, even if it still couldn't completely save him. Though you could also argue that being stuck in a pod that could potentially prolong your painful death isn't exactly an improvement. Still, when compared to our top spot, we feel that this wasn't quite the worst way to go. Taking the gold medal for most gruesome DreamWorks villain death, we have the dragon that is appropriately named the Red Death from the first How to Train Your Dragon movie. Though this monster of a dragon seemed nearly impossible to beat, the Red Death had the same weakness that every dragon has. When Toothless shoots a ball of fire into her mouth, the Red Death is completely powerless to stop what comes next. With the firepower that she already had, that one fireball was able to ignite her internal methane fuel, which naturally caused her inner gas chambers, as it were, to explode and tear her apart from the inside. This was all happening while the Red Death was falling, with her wings actually burning up because of the fire, which prevented her from trying to fly towards the ocean to try and douse the flames. The force of finally hitting the ground was enough to bring the full explosion outwards. Between the helplessness that the Red Death must have felt during her death, the prolonged and painful nature of it due to the explosion being internal and needing to properly build up, and the final fiery landing, we can easily say that this is the most gruesome villain death in all of DreamWorks Animation. But let us know in the comments section below what you think is the most gruesome DreamWorks villain death. And tell us what studio or series we should feature on gruesome deaths next. And make sure to hit that notification bell for more Good to Evil, where we break down the morality of the characters in your favorite movies, cartoons, and shows. But most importantly, stay wicked.